My neighbor knocked on my door with an apologetic smile. "My shower's broken," she said. "Could you fix it? I'll make dinner." I stared at Sarah for a beat too long. 36, confident, the kind of woman who made me question everything I thought I knew about myself. "Just dinner?" I asked. Her laugh was soft, knowing. "We'll see. Hello, I'm Marcus. I'm 24, work with my hands, and I've always been the type who notices things." The way she lingered in my doorway. How her invitation felt different from neighborly politeness. How 12 years suddenly seemed like nothing when she looked at me like that. I'd been living next door for 6 months, catching glimpses of her through windows, hearing her laugh through thin walls. But I'd never imagined she'd been watching too. What happened next changed everything I thought I understood about age. Timing, and the kind of connection that makes you forget to breathe. But before we begin, let me know where in the world you're watching from today. It's always fascinating seeing who's joining us from around the world. I've lived in the duplex for 6 months now, and in all that time, Sarah and I have existed in a careful dance of almost meetings. Through my kitchen window, I catch glimpses of her morning routine, the graceful way she reaches for her coffee mug, how she absently tucks her hair behind her ear while reading the news on her tablet. We exchange polite nods when we happen to check our mailboxes at the same time, or when one of us is bringing in groceries while the other is heading out. She carries herself with a quiet confidence that makes the 12 years between us feel like more. At 39 to my 27, she inhabits a different world, one of established routines and assured decisions. I notice the small details, how she always parks her car in exactly the same spot, the way her garden beds are perfectly maintained, the reliable rhythm of her coming and going. You know those moments when you're hyper-aware of someone's presence, even though you barely interact? That's how it's been. I find myself listening for the sound of her car in the evening, wondering if she's home alone or if she has company. Sometimes I catch her looking my way through her kitchen window, and there's a split second of connection before we both pretend to be absorbed in whatever we're doing. This particular Tuesday evening, I had just gotten home from work. I'd loosened my tie and was contemplating whether to heat up leftover pasta or order takeout when I heard a knock at my door. Not the mail carrier's quick rap or a delivery person's hurried knock, but 3 distinct, deliberate taps. When I opened the door, Sarah stood there with an apologetic smile that made something flutter in my chest. She wore dark jeans and a soft-looking sweater in deep green, her hair falling in waves around her shoulders. "Hi, Marcus," she said, and I realized it was the first time I'd heard her say my name. "I hate to bother you, but I'm having an issue with my shower. It's barely getting any pressure, and I remembered you mentioned you do some handyman work." I had mentioned it months ago, during one of our brief exchanges, a passing comment about helping my clients with home repairs. I was surprised she'd remembered. "Yeah, I'd be happy to take a look," I heard myself say. She shifted slightly, tucking that same strand of hair behind her ear like I'd seen her do so many times through the window. "I was thinking," she paused, and something in her tone made me pay closer attention. "I could make dinner as a thank you. I was planning to cook anyway, and it seemed silly to eat alone when you'd be right there." The invitation hung in the air between us, and I found myself studying her expression, trying to read between the lines. Was this just neighborly gratitude, or was there something more in the way she held my gaze? I noticed she was wearing a light perfume, something warm and subtle that made me want to lean closer. "That would be great," I said, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded despite the sudden racing of my pulse. "Let me just grab my tools." She smiled then, a real smile that reached her eyes and made her look younger somehow. "Perfect. I'll leave the door unlocked. Come over whenever you're ready." She turned to go, then glanced back over her shoulder. "I hope you like Italian." As I watched her walk back to her side of the duplex, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about a broken shower. Maybe it was the way she'd hesitated before mentioning dinner, or how she'd seemed to choose her words so carefully. Or maybe I was reading too much into it, seeing what I wanted to see in this simple request for help. I stood in my hallway for a moment, tools in hand, thinking about how the evening had suddenly shifted into something unexpected. Through the shared wall between our units, I could hear the faint sounds of her moving around her kitchen, and I found myself holding my breath, trying to imagine what might be waiting on the other side of that door. I stood in my hallway for another moment, gathering my thoughts along with my tools. The memory of Sarah in my doorway felt almost dreamlike, the way she'd lingered there, how her invitation had carried a weight different from simple neighborliness. My hands moved on autopilot, selecting wrenches and pliers from my toolbox, while my mind replayed the subtle shifts in her expression. You know that feeling when something ordinary suddenly becomes extraordinary? When a mundane Tuesday evening transforms into something else? That's where I found myself, trying to steady my breathing as I walked a few steps to her door. The door was unlocked as promised, and I knocked softly before entering. "Sarah?" "Come on in," her voice carried from somewhere inside. "I'm just getting things started for dinner." Her apartment was a mirror image of mine in layout, but that's where the similarity ended. Where my space was functional and somewhat sparse, hers was thoughtfully curated, elegant without feeling staged. The walls displayed black and white photographs in simple frames, and carefully chosen pieces of furniture created intimate seating areas. Everything spoke to her background and design, from the artfully arranged bookshelf to the way throw pillows. Added precise pops of color to her neutral sofa. The kitchen smelled of garlic and herbs, and Sarah stood at the counter chopping vegetables. She looked up with a warm smile. "The bathroom's just down the hall. Would you like coffee while you work?" "That would be great, thanks." I tried not to notice how the kitchen lights caught the silver strands in her dark hair, or how comfortable she looked in her own space. The bathroom was small, cozy, really, with just enough room for the essentials. Geometric tiles and soft grays covered the floor, and a vintage mirror hung above a modern sink. As I set my tools down and began examining the shower head, I heard Sarah's footsteps approaching. "Here's your coffee," she said, and the small space suddenly felt smaller. She handed me the mug, our fingers brushing briefly. "Mind if I stay and chat while you work?" "I promise not to backseat plumber." I laughed, grateful for the break in tension. "Please do. Though I should warn you, my running commentary on pipe maintenance might not be riveting conversation." "Oh, I don't know." She leaned against the doorframe, crossing her arms. "I find competence very interesting." The way she said it made me glad I was facing the shower wall. I focused on unscrewing the shower head, hyper-aware of her presence behind me. "How long has it been giving you trouble?" "About a week." It started gradually. I barely noticed at first. She shifted slightly, and I felt her shoulder brush against mine as she pointed at the fixture. But this morning it was barely a trickle. Working. In such close quarters, every small movement felt magnified. When I had to reach past her for a different wrench, the scent of her perfume made my heart skip. We kept bumping into each other in the tiny space, each contact followed by soft, "sorry," and shared laughs about the apartment's quirks. "The joys of old buildings," she said after one such collision. "Though I suppose it has its advantages too, bringing neighbors together." I glanced at her, trying to read her tone, but she was looking at the shower head I'd just removed. "Ah, here's your problem," I said, showing her the buildup of mineral deposits. "Pretty common in these older pipes. Nothing serious." While I cleaned out the shower head and checked the water pressure, Sarah told me about her work, her voice mixing, with the quiet clink of tools and the distant sounds of dinner preparation. I found myself wanting to draw out the repair, enjoying the easy flow of conversation and the way she seemed genuinely interested in my responses. Finally, everything was back in place. "That should do it," I said, wiping my hands on the towel. She'd provided, "But you'll want to test it to make sure." Perfect timing. Dinner needs about 10 more minutes anyway. She straightened up from where she'd been leaning. "Why don't you wait in the living room while I check the shower? Make yourself comfortable." Comfortable. I gathered my tools and moved to the living room, settling on her sofa. The sound of running water carried clearly through the apartment, and I found myself acutely aware of its implications. The domestic intimacy of the moment, me sitting in her space while she tested her shower, created an atmosphere that felt both comfortable and charged with possibility. The water shut off, and I heard her call out, "Marcus, it's perfect." "Thank you." I sat there, coffee mug warm in my hands, trying to sort through my reactions to the last hour. The easy conversation, the accidental touches, the way she'd stayed to keep me company instead of returning to her cooking. It all felt significant in a way I couldn't quite define. I followed Sarah's voice back to the kitchen, where she was draining pasta at the sink. The steam rose around her, catching the warm light from the pendant lamp above. Something about the domesticity of the scene made my chest tighten. "I hope you like garlic," she said, glancing over her shoulder. I might have gone a bit overboard. "The more the better," I assured her, hovering uncertainly until she gestured toward a drawer. "Silverware's there, if you wouldn't mind setting the table." Her small dining table sat in an alcove by the window, just big enough for 2 people. I arranged the forks and napkins while she brought over plates laden with pasta, tossed with cherry, tomatoes, and fresh herbs. A bottle of red wine appeared, and before I knew it, we were settled across from each other in the gentle glow of her table lamp. "This looks amazing," I said, and meant it. The pasta was perfectly al dente, the sauce rich with garlic and olive oil. "It's nothing fancy," Sarah replied, but I caught the pleased smile as she poured the wine. "Just something I throw together when I don't want to think too hard about cooking." The wine was good, better than what I usually bought for myself, and the conversation flowed as easily as the pour. Sarah told me about her work as a graphic designer, how she'd recently moved back to the city after years away. "Starting over isn't quite what I expected," she admitted, twirling pasta around her fork. "I thought because I grew up here, it would feel more familiar, I guess. But everything's different now. Most of my old friends have moved away or are busy with their families." I nodded, understanding more than she might have guessed. "The city has a way of making you feel simultaneously surrounded by people and completely alone." "Exactly." She looked up, meeting my eyes. "Sorry, that sounds more melancholy than I intended." "It's not all bad. I love my work, and I'm rediscovering places I'd forgotten about, like this neighborhood." "What made you choose this building?" I asked, genuinely curious. She laughed, a warm sound that seemed to fill the small space between us. "Would you believe it was the windows? The light in here reminded me of my first apartment after college. Plus, the rent was reasonable, and I liked that it felt like a real neighborhood, not just another soulless complex." I found myself sharing my own observations about the area. The old man who walked his corgi at precisely 6:15 every morning, the competing aromas from the Indian and Italian restaurants down the street, the way the whole block came alive during first Friday art walks. Sarah listened intently, asking questions that showed she was genuinely interested. When I mentioned the secret shortcut through the alley behind the coffee shop, she leaned forward, elbows on the table. "See, this is exactly what I've been missing, someone to tell me all the neighborhood secrets." The table was small enough that this brought her notably closer, and I became acutely aware of how her knee was just inches from mine under the table. The wine had left a slight flush on her cheeks, and a strand of hair had fallen forward that she kept absently tucking behind her ear. "I feel a bit foolish now," she said suddenly, sitting back slightly, "asking you over just to fix something so simple. You probably thought it was ridiculous." There was a vulnerability in her voice that caught me off guard, as if she was really asking something else entirely. I set down my wine glass, choosing my words carefully. "I'm glad you asked," I said quietly, holding her gaze. "Honestly, even if it was just a clogged shower head." Something shifted in her expression, a softening around her eyes, a slight parting of her lips. The moment stretched between us, filled with unspoken possibilities. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than before. "So am I." The moment lingered, delicate as sponge sugar, until Sarah cleared her throat softly. "Should we move to the living room? It might be more comfortable, and there's still some wine left." I helped her clear the plates, our movements careful around each other in the small kitchen. Every brush of shoulders or accidental touch felt charged with new meaning. The dishwasher hummed to life, and she led the way to the living room, wine. Glasses in hand, her living room was as thoughtfully arranged as the rest of her apartment. A plush sectional faced a modest TV with a reading lamp creating a warm pool of light in the corner. Sarah settled onto one end of the couch, tucking her feet underneath her in a way that made her seem younger, more relaxed. I took the adjacent corner, close enough for easy conversation, but maintaining a respectful distance. "So tell me more about your work," she said, cradling her wine glass. "You mentioned earlier you do IT consulting?" I explained my job, watching how intently she listened. When I described a particularly challenging project, she leaned forward, genuinely engaged. The lamplight caught in her hair, creating subtle highlights I'd never noticed before. Her hands moved expressively as she shared her own work stories, her passion for design evident in every gesture. "The generational differences can be interesting," she mused, after I mentioned a client's resistance to new technology. "I'm right in between, old enough to remember life before smartphones, young enough to adapt pretty quickly. But sometimes I feel like I'm translating between two different worlds." "I can imagine," I said, thinking about the 12 years between us. "Though I have to say, you seem more in touch with current trends than some people my age." She laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "Maybe that's the designer in me. We have to stay current or get left behind." Her expression turned thoughtful. "But sometimes I miss the slower pace of before, when people had to really be present with each other, you know?" I nodded, acutely aware of how present I felt in this moment, the soft light, the wine's warmth in my chest, the way her fingers absently traced the rim of her glass. Our conversation meandered through topics: favorite books, travel dreams, the changes we'd both seen in the city. Throughout it all, something unspoken hummed between us, making every shared smile and moment of eye contact feel weighted with possibility. As the evening naturally began to wind down, I noticed Sarah stifling a small yawn. "I should probably head back," I said, though the words came reluctantly. She nodded, but neither of us moved immediately. The moment stretched, comfortable yet charged with potential. Finally, I stood, and she walked me to her door. "Thank you again," she said, pausing with her hand on the doorknob. "Not just for fixing the shower, but for this. It was nice to really talk with someone." "It was," I agreed softly. She reached out then, her hand resting briefly on my arm. The simple contact sent warmth spreading through me, and I found myself holding my breath. Her touch lingered for just a moment before she drew back, offering a smile that held something I couldn't quite read. Back in my own apartment, I stood at my kitchen window, the evening replaying in my mind. The space felt emptier than usual, echoing with the absence of her voice, her laughter. Something had shifted between us. The careful distance of neighborly politeness transformed into what? I wasn't sure, but I could still feel the ghost of her touch on my arm. Still see the way she'd looked at me in those final moments. I wondered if she was thinking about it too. Just one wall away. 3 weeks can feel like an eternity when you're living next to a question mark. Every morning, I found myself listening for Sarah's footsteps on the stairs, the familiar sound of her car starting, the click of her heels on the walkway. Our paths crossed occasionally, me heading to work, her returning from a coffee run, or both of us collecting mail from the boxes downstairs. Each time, we exchanged the same neighborly waves we always had. But now they carried the weight of that evening, of wine-warmed conversations and lingering touches. I caught myself watching her kitchen window more than I should, drawn to the warm light and occasional glimpses of her moving through her evening routine. Sometimes she'd be on the phone, gesturing animatedly as she talked. Other times, she'd be working late at her desk, the blue glow of her computer screen painting her profile in soft light. Once I saw her dancing while doing dishes, and the unguarded moment made me smile despite myself. During the day, I buried myself in work, tackling client problems with perhaps more focus than they required. But in quiet moments, my mind would drift to the memory of her laugh, the way she'd tucked her feet under herself on the couch, how her hand had felt on my arm. I'd find myself hoping for another loose cabinet handle or stubborn door, any excuse to bridge the careful distance we'd maintained since that night. But was I reading too much into it? Maybe for her, it had just been a pleasant evening with a helpful neighbor, nothing more. The age gap between us felt more pronounced now, a constant reminder of all the reasons this unnamed thing between us might be better left unexplored. I was reviewing work orders on my laptop, trying to organize my schedule for the following week, when I heard it, 3 soft knocks that made my heart stumble in its rhythm. I knew before I opened the door that it would be her. Sarah stood in the hallway, but something was different this time. Gone was the apologetic smile from 3 weeks ago, replaced by something more deliberate. Her eyes met mine with a quiet certainty that made my pulse quicken. "Hi," she said, and even that simple word seemed to carry more weight than before. "I have a favor to ask, if you're not too busy?" "Of course," I replied, trying to keep my voice casual. "What's wrong?" "My kitchen sink has developed this maddening drip." She ran a hand through her hair, a gesture I was beginning to recognize as a sign of mild frustration. "It's not terrible during the day, but at night, I swear it gets louder just to spite me. I've been lying awake listening to it, and I thought maybe." She trailed off, but her eyes stayed steady on mine. This wasn't the same hesitant request from before. There was an assurance in her posture, in the way she let the silence stretch between us, that suggested she knew exactly what she was asking, and it wasn't just about fixing a leaky faucet. "I can take a look," I said, already reaching for my tools. "When would be good for you?" "Now works, if you're free." The slight lift at the end made it a question, but her smile held a knowing edge that hadn't been there 3 weeks ago. "I promise not to keep you too late this time. Unless you want to stay, of course." The words hung in the air between us, charged with possibility. We'd moved past the polite fiction of simple neighborliness, and we both knew it. This wasn't just about a dripping faucet any more than the last time had been just about a shower. Let me grab my wrench," I said, holding her gaze for a moment longer than necessary. Her smile widened slightly, and I felt that familiar warmth spread through my chest. This time, when I followed her to her door, it felt less like helping a neighbor and more like stepping into something we'd both been waiting for. The question was, what would we do about it? Sarah's kitchen felt different this time, warmer, more familiar. Maybe it was because I'd been here before. Or maybe it was the way she didn't try to maintain that polite distance as I set my tools on the counter. She stood close enough that I could catch the light scent of her shampoo, something floral and subtle that made me think of spring mornings. "It's this one," she said, reaching past me to turn the faucet handle. The drip started immediately, a steady plink 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 that echoed in the metal sink. "See what I mean about it being maddening?" I nodded, leaning in to examine the faucet. "How long has it been doing this?" "A few days." She moved closer, her shoulder brushing against mine. As she pointed, "It seems to come from right here." Her hand guided mine to the base of the faucet, and neither of us pulled away immediately. Her fingers were cool against my skin, steady and deliberate in their movement. "Yeah, I can feel where it's loose," I said, my voice coming out a bit rougher than I intended. "Probably just needs the cartridge replaced. Should be a pretty quick fix." She stayed close as I worked, handing me tools before I could ask for them, as if we'd done this 100 times before. The small kitchen meant we had to navigate around each other, each slight contact carrying more weight than it should. When I reached for the wrench, her hand met mine halfway, passing it over with a smile that made me forget what I was doing for a moment. "So how have you been?" she asked, leaning against the counter beside me. "Still dealing with that difficult client you told me about?" The fact that she remembered our conversation from weeks ago caught me off guard. Actually, that situation got better. Turns out they just needed someone to really listen to what they wanted. Isn't that what most people need? Her voice held a note of something I couldn't quite read. When I glanced up, she was watching me with that same steady gaze from earlier. Working together fell into an easy rhythm. She held the flashlight while I checked the connections, asked questions that showed she was genuinely interested in understanding what I was doing. The conversation flowed naturally between us, picking up threads from our dinner weeks ago, as if no time had passed. "I should probably order some dinner," she said after a while, stepping back to grab her phone. "Chinese, okay? I know this great place that delivers." "Sounds perfect," I replied, focusing on tightening the last connection. The domesticity of the moment struck me. Her ordering food while I fixed her sink, the casual way she asked about my preferences, how normal it all felt. When the food arrived, I had just finished testing the faucet. No more drips. Sarah cleared a space at her small kitchen table, pushing aside some work papers to make room for the takeout boxes. The overhead light was dim, casting everything in a soft glow that made the moment feel somehow separate from regular time. She'd ordered enough for both of us without asking, and something about that assumption, that of course I would stay, made my chest feel warm. We sat across from each other, sharing containers of lo mein and kung pao chicken, our chopsticks occasionally meeting as we reached for the same piece. In the gentle kitchen light, I found myself studying her face while she talked about a challenging project at work. The way her eyes crinkled slightly when she smiled, how she gestured with her chopsticks to emphasize a point, the subtle streak of gray at her temple that caught the light when she moved. Details I hadn't noticed before seemed suddenly important. "What?" she asked, catching me watching her. "Nothing," I said, but couldn't help smiling. "This is nice, that's all." She held my gaze for a moment, her own smile softening. "It is, isn't it?" The way she said it felt like she was talking about more than just dinner. The easy intimacy of sharing takeout in her kitchen, talking about everything and nothing, felt significant in a way I couldn't quite explain. Every now and then, she'd laugh at something I said, and the sound would fill the small space between us, making it feel even more intimate. I couldn't help wondering if she felt it too, this sense of rightness, of pieces falling into place. Without effort or explanation, the conversation shifted as we cleared away empty containers, but neither of us moved to end the evening. Sarah twisted her napkin between her fingers, a gesture that seemed more thoughtful than nervous. "Can I tell you something?" she asked, looking up at me. "I've been divorced for 2 years now. Sometimes I still feel like I'm trying to figure out what I actually want, you know? Not what I thought I was supposed to want in my 20s, but what I really want now." The honesty in her voice made me want to match it. "I get that, actually, just from the other direction." I paused, choosing my words carefully. "Most women my age, it's like we're speaking different languages sometimes. They're all about Instagram perfect moments and 5-year plans. I feel caught between being a kid and whatever comes next." She nodded, her expression softening. "That must be frustrating. Being aware enough to see it, but still having to navigate it." "Exactly." I found myself leaning forward, drawn in by her understanding. Everyone's racing towards some imaginary finish line, but I'm still trying to figure out what race I'm even in. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice gentle. "Not what you think you should want, but really want?" "Want?" The question caught me off guard with its simplicity. No one had asked me that in quite that way before. "I want work that matters," I said slowly. "I like helping people fix things, solving problems. I love this neighborhood, how it feels. Lived in, real, not like those shiny new developments." Sarah smiled, warming to the topic. "I've noticed you're good at that. Fixing things, I mean. You approach problems differently than most people I know. More patient, maybe? You've been thinking about that?" The words slipped out before I could catch them. "I have," she admitted, meeting my eyes. "You seem more grounded than most guys your age. More present." There was something in her tone that made me think she'd been considering this for a while. Maybe since that first dinner. We talked about our different perspectives, how her experience had taught her what she didn't want, while I was still discovering what I did want. But instead of highlighting the gap between us, each revelation seemed to build another bridge of understanding. "It's funny," she said. How sometimes the people who make the most sense to us aren't the ones who look perfect on paper. I couldn't help but agree, watching how the kitchen light played across her face as she spoke, making her eyes bright with warmth and something that looked a lot like possibility. We moved to her living room, where the soft glow of a table lamp created pools of warm light. Sarah's couch was small, making the space feel even more intimate. I settled at one end while she took the other, tucking her feet under herself like she had that first evening. The wine had left me feeling warm but clear-headed, aware of every subtle shift in the room. Our conversation drifted into comfortable silences, the kind that felt more like punctuation than awkwardness. I noticed how Sarah would lean forward when making a point, how her hand would sometimes rest on the cushion between us. As we talked, she gradually shifted closer, eliminating the careful distance we'd maintained. My heart picked up speed with each small movement, though I tried to keep my voice steady. When she paused mid-sentence, studying my face, I knew something was about to change. "Do I make you nervous?" she asked directly, her eyes holding mine. The question caught me off guard, but something about her openness made it impossible to be anything but honest. "Yes," I admitted, managing a small smile, "but in the best possible way." She laughed softly at that, moving closer still. Close enough now that I could see flecks of gold in her brown eyes, catch the subtle vanilla and jasmine notes of her perfume. The lamplight caught in her hair, creating shadows that made everything feel dreamlike. "We should probably talk about this," she said quietly, gesturing between us. "The age difference. Does it bother you?" I asked, though my attention had shifted to her lips, the way they curved slightly as she considered her answer. "I think," she began, but I found myself leaning forward before she could finish, drawn by something stronger than words. The kiss was soft, questioning, barely more than a brush of lips against lips, but it sent electricity through my entire body. When I pulled back, Sarah's eyes were wide with surprise, though her slight smile told me it wasn't unwelcome. A moment of silence stretched between us, heavy with possibility. Then Sarah took a breath, her voice barely above a whisper. "We should probably talk about what we're doing before we do anything else." The words hung in the air between us, both a pause and a promise. My heart was still racing from the kiss, but I knew she was right. Whatever was happening between us deserved more than rushed decisions in the dim light of her living room. Morning came with golden light, streaming through Sarah's kitchen windows, catching dust motes in its beam. I'd barely slept, replaying our kiss, and the moment after in my mind. When she texted asking me to come over for breakfast and coffee, my stomach did a little flip. Now we sat across from each other at her small table, steam rising from our mugs. Sarah had made eggs and toast, but neither of us was eating much. The charged energy from last night had shifted into something more serious, more deliberate. "I keep trying to find the right way to start this conversation," Sarah said, tracing the rim of her coffee mug with one finger. The morning light caught the silver strands in her hair, making them shine. "Me too," I admitted, watching her hand move. "I think we both know what we want to talk about, but we're both being so careful." She smiled, though it held a touch of frustration. "You know what? I'm tired of overthinking everything." She set her mug down firmly. "What are you afraid of, really?" The directness of her question caught me off guard, but maybe that's what we needed. I took a breath, deciding to match her honesty. "I'm afraid I'm too young for your world," I said quietly. "That I won't have the experience or sophistication someone like you deserves. That you'll realize I'm just playing at being a grown-up." To my surprise, Sarah laughed, not mockingly, but with genuine warmth that made her eyes crinkle at the corners. "Oh, that's funny," she said, shaking her head. "Because I'm terrified I'm too complicated for your world. That I come with too much baggage, too many expectations. Things someone your age shouldn't have to deal with." Something loosened in my chest at her words. We'd been so careful, trying to protect each other from our own insecurities, that we'd nearly missed seeing how well they fit together. "I want to find out," I said, meeting her eyes. "Either way. I want to know if those fears matter as much as we think they do." Sarah looked at me for a long moment, then set her coffee mug down with a decisive click against the table. The morning light caught her face as she smiled, and I knew something had shifted between us, something that felt like the beginning of an answer. Sarah's fingers stilled on her coffee mug, and her eyes met mine with an intensity that made my breath catch. "I've been hoping you'd say that," she said softly, her voice carrying a warmth that dissolved the last traces of uncertainty between us. "I've been hoping for weeks." When she reached across the table to take my hand, it felt different from every accidental brush or friendly touch we'd shared before. This was deliberate, certain, her fingers intertwining with mine with quiet purpose. The morning light painted patterns on our joined hands, and I found myself mesmerized by the contrast of her silver rings against my skin. I stood from my chair, drawn by some gravity I couldn't name, and Sarah rose to meet me. This kiss was nothing like our tentative first one from the night before. It held all the certainty we'd found in our morning confession, all the wanting we'd been dancing around for weeks. Her hand came up to rest against my chest, and I could feel her smile against my lips. When we finally broke apart, Sarah took a small step back. Her eyes were bright as she extended her hand to me, and I understood the weight of the gesture immediately. This wasn't just an invitation. It was a door opening between what we had been to each other and what we could become. I took her offered hand without hesitation. The careful friendship we'd built was transforming into something else entirely. But it didn't feel like we were losing anything. Instead, it felt like every shared laugh, every lingering look, every late-night conversation had been leading us here. As Sarah led me away from the kitchen table toward her bedroom, the morning sun warm on our backs, I felt the rightness of the moment settle into my bones. We'd found our answer, and we were choosing it together. The dawn crept in through Sarah's curtains, painting the room in gentle stripes of gold and shadow. I lay there, watching the light dance across her skin as she traced invisible patterns on my chest with her fingertips. The quiet between us felt natural, comfortable, like we'd found a space where words weren't necessary. I could still feel the echo of every kiss, every whispered word from the hours before. My body was heavy with contentment, and Sarah's weight against my side felt like she belonged there. The morning held that dreamy quality where time seems to move differently, slower and sweeter than usual. She shifted slightly, propping her chin on my chest to look up at me. There was something playful dancing in her eyes that I hadn't seen before, a lightness that made her look younger somehow. Her hair was delightfully mussed, and I couldn't resist running my fingers through it. "I have a confession to make," she sighed, her lips curving into a mischievous smile. "That first night I asked you over, my shower was working perfectly fine." I laughed softly, the sound rumbling in my chest where she lay against me. "I had a feeling," I admitted, watching her. Eyes widened slightly. "The water pressure seemed pretty good when you tested it." Her laughter joined mine, quiet and intimate in the morning light. "And you still came over to help anyway?" "Of course I did." I traced my fingers along her shoulder. "I'd been looking for an excuse to talk to you for months." The honesty felt like unwrapping another layer between us, the last of our pretenses falling away in the gentle morning light. Sarah's smile softened, and she pressed a kiss to my chest, right over my heart. The morning light filled Sarah's kitchen as we moved around each other, falling into an easy rhythm while making coffee. She wore my button-down shirt from the night before, the hem hitting mid-thigh, and I couldn't help but smile at how natural it looked on her. I'd never seen anything quite so perfect as the way she reached past me for the coffee filters, her hair still messy from sleep. "What time do you need to be at work?" she asked, measuring out the grounds while I filled the water reservoir. 9:30, I said, leaning against her counter. "Plenty of time." She glanced at me with a slight smirk. "Think Mrs. Henderson next door heard anything last night?" "If she did, she's probably just jealous." I wrapped my arms around her waist from behind, breathing in the scent of her shampoo. Sarah turned in my embrace, her expression growing more serious. "Do you regret anything about last night?" "No," I said without hesitation, meeting her eyes. "But I want to know what this means for us going forward." She took a thoughtful sip of her coffee, considering my words. Honestly, I think we should figure it out as we go. I don't have all the answers about the age difference or timing or any of it, but I know I want to keep exploring this with you." The coffee maker burbled its last drops as she spoke, filling the kitchen with warmth and promise. When I finally gathered my things to head back to my apartment and get ready for work, Sarah walked me to her door. The kiss goodbye felt different from any we'd shared before, domestic, comfortable, like we'd been doing this for years instead of hours. Like a preview of countless mornings to come. "See you later?" she asked, one hand resting on my chest. I covered her hand with mine, feeling her heartbeat through the thin fabric of my borrowed shirt. Definitely. If tonight's ending felt right, hit subscribe and share this with one person who needs a gentle story. I'll be here tomorrow with another.